Good morning. My name is Tracy Mason, and I am the general manager here at ASU Kerr, and we are so glad that you found us. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedules and everything to come join us on this glorious morning, a lovely spring morning. And I would like to, if you wouldn't mind, give some gratitude to Renegade Coffee for the lovely coffee and crumpets while you waited today. They're such a lovely sponsor, and we love frequenting Renegade quite often. I do sandwiches, they've got all kinds of things, so we hope that you will also frequent Renegade. And I would like to just mention a couple of things. If this is your first time here and you need the restroom, it is right at that corner back there. And we hope that you'll please check your devices so that there's no noises going off during the presentation to disrupt this wonderful presentation you'll have today. And I'm told there's lots of singing, so that's exciting. I also want to thank you for your patience this morning. So sometimes with live presentations, live theater, live music, sometimes there are technology challenges that prevent the house from being open right away. So we appreciate your patience with that. It's not always the case. We are very good about opening the doors on time, but this morning there was a little bit of technology challenge, but we got through it and everything's going to be great. At this point, I would also like to mention a couple of things. You know, if you look around, you see this is a pretty full house, and we like to keep it that way. So with your help, when you're telling your friends and family to come join us, that is super helpful to us. When you go to our website and check out what events are coming, and then you come and buy tickets, that is a big help to us too. And we still have a few shows lined up. We have tomorrow night, we have a jazz show. Come out and support your local jazz artists by coming here. Tickets are only $20. There's still some tickets left for that. That's tomorrow night. It's called Sonrisa, and that's going to be a lot of fun. And on Friday night, we have our Gather Storytelling. So come on out for that. It's 4 great stories. One is a cultural story, and then we have a Q&A after that. And, you know, we have now Comedy at Kerr. So we have some other series that we are developing and keeping up. So we hope you will come out and join us for some of these events and watch for other events coming up through the summer. We are trying to stretch the season for those that are here year-round. Been listening, been hearing some of you say that, so that's what we're aiming for. And at this point, I am super happy to introduce Arizona Opera. Please put your hands together. Warm welcome.
Good morning. Can I get this? I'm going to see if I can get this higher. Sorry. Okay, I think that'll be better. Is that better? Can you hear me? Okay, yay. That way I'm not like squatting the whole time. Hi, my name is Dr. Miriam Schildkret. I am an artist ambassador with Arizona Opera. I've been with the company in many different ways for over a decade now, which is crazy. I've sung in the chorus a lot. I was an education teaching artist, bringing opera into schools for about 5 seasons. And now I do a lot of lecturing and gigging around. So I am so excited to be here today to talk about one of my favorite composers of all time, Mozart, and his opera Don Giovanni, which you can see in just a couple weeks. So hopefully we will all see you again at Symphony Hall for Don Giovanni. I'll give a plug later. So, and because of our technical difficulties, I'll be kind of like asking for the slide to move. So thank you for your patience with that. We had an internet outage in Central Phoenix, so we do what we can, right? And that's live theater for you. So if we could advance the next slide. If you've been to any of my talks before, the way I like to think is I like to think broad and then get more narrow. So you may have seen some similar things when I talked about Magic Flute, I believe a year ago. So I apologize for some of the review, but we need to be reminded more than we need to be taught sometimes, right? So opera. What is opera? Well, at Arizona Opera, we say that it is storytelling through music. And this is a genre that has been around for a very, very long time, about 400 years. And if you think about how much the world has changed, even 400 years, opera has changed that much too. So we are going almost all the way back to the beginning of opera. The really earliest operas that we had were during the Baroque period, during the 17th century. But Mozart's opera, or opera written during the classical period, is what we see most frequently. So this will be the earliest operas that you will see performed. And opera during this time period was very different than it is now, and even the way that audience members enjoyed opera was very different from how it is now. So, of course, back then, it was mainly a form of entertainment. People went to be entertained, to escape their day-to-day lives, just like we do when we go to the theater. So, at the end of the day, if you go to see Don Giovanni, we want you to have a good time. That's the same all across those 400 years. But if you think back to, now I guess 300 years ago, to the 18th century, this was a time period when you couldn't speak freely about your leader, right? Or you had to be very guarded with your words. And the opera house had this great advantage that it was often pretty noisy because a lot of people were making a lot of noise on stage. So it also was a safe place where people could go, they could gossip, they could talk about the goings on and not be overheard. So if you feel like opera has a lot of start and stop, or it's kind of long and boring and slow during this time period, keep in mind that's because people weren't really focusing the whole time like we do now. So of course, in modern performances, we try to make sure that there's a lot of action, that there's a lot happening on stage so that we stay engaged. But that wouldn't have been the same way. People could have talked, they could have their wine, they could chat. It also was just a way to show that you were part of the upper crust of society. Operas were put on usually for an event or for a ruler, and it was just a big party, basically. And if you were invited to see an opera, that meant that you were part of that elite. And so it was a way that people could show off the latest fashion, they could see the who's who of society, show that they were part of who's who, they could court, all of these important things. So this 18th century, or 1700s, that's kind of how we talk about dates in history, it was also known as the Age of Enlightenment. And this is when the classical period took place. Now I know that's confusing because we talk about classical music as a whole, but the classical period was this specific century. And during the Age of Enlightenment, there were a lot of advances in science and mathematics, and because of that, people really valued reason and rational thought. And so we see that a lot in the arts. So up here, I have an image of the Oath of the Herati by David, which was painted during this century towards the end. And this is a great example of that kind of rational balance that we look for or pay attention to during this century. So we see very much in the center of the painting that oath that's pulling our eye there, and then this juxtaposition of the soldiers and all of the geometric shapes that they're making, lots of triangles, how your eye is drawn to those swords, opposed to the women who are in a similar but much softer, sadder place. So there's balance happening of the violence and the sadness, or the pride of this oath that they're taking. Plus, of course, everything is divided by those arcs on top. You have the middle arc showing where the focus of the painting is, but then you have the men towards the arc on the left and the women towards the arc on the right. So if you're a more visual person, this is a great way to represent a lot of the balance and rationality that we have in music during the classical period. Musical form was very important during this time period. We have a form specifically called sonata form, which is pretty complicated. We study it a lot in school, but it's basically a harmonic form, meaning you start in one key, and then the themes move into a different key, and then they go to a lot of different keys before finally everything comes back in that original key. So everything ends, and even plot-wise in operas, we'll see things where if couples begin together, maybe they have some conflicts, but they end up together. There's this balance, this resolution. So it was very important during the classical period. But interestingly, I'm gonna ahead of myself. So another thing to listen for during this time period is recitative versus aria. This is something that's specific for opera. Recitative is sung dialogue. It moves the plot forward. And during this time period in particular, it has a very different sound from the sung arias or ensembles where people would reflect on the emotion that they're feeling. You also, during this time period, get two different types of recitative. There's secco recitative, which means dry, so there's only harpsichord accompaniment, just chords being rolled underneath, and then accompagnato, which means accompanied, where the full orchestra accompanies that recitative. So that's usually more emotional and more high stakes than leading into a pretty emotional aria. So there is quite a lot of start and stop in this period, again, because people might have been chatting, maybe not paying attention too much during some of those recitatives, and then when an aria was happening or a really amazing ensemble, then they would pay attention. All right, we can have our next slide. So that brings us to the main operatic composer during this time period, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who, like I said, is one of my favorite composers of all time. He is an incredible composer. He writes bunches of great music, not just opera, but symphonies, string quartets, piano music, organ, choral. He wrote a bunch. And like I said, he is really the classical operatic composer that we talk about during this time period. He really dominated the art form during his very short life. So he was a child prodigy, so he started writing music around the age of 5, but he wrote his first opera when he was 11, and over the course of his life, he wrote 20 just operas. He wrote like hundreds of music, but over 20 operas during his lifetime. And he died very young, at the age of 35. We're not really sure exactly why he died. If you know the movie or play Amadeus, of course, there's some great, wonderful speculation about Salieri poisoning him because he was jealous and all these things. Unfortunately, makes a good story. We don't think that's really what happened. Probably Mozart just got sick, as so many people did during that age. But I like to wonder what would have happened had he lived into the next century, into the Romantic period. We talk a lot about, for instance, a composer like Beethoven, who spans the classical and Romantic periods, and we can see his musical composition change as the time period changes, as he deals with his own aging. And so I wonder, because Mozart plays a little bit with some different things in Don Giovanni, in Magic Flute, that I wonder, okay, what would he have done if he was going into the early 19th century? But sadly, he didn't. So the other great thing about Mozart is we know a lot about him as a person because he wrote a lot of letters during his life to many people. His father, Leopold, who was really influential in his music education, there's some great letters that he writes about the opera Idomeneo, where he's talking about having to rewrite some of the music for the tenor who was singing Idomeneo because he was aging and he wanted to make sure he was still showcasing his voice well. But Mozart also was an incredible jokester. He has lots of potty humor in his letters. He even writes about when he's playing pranks on people in shows themselves. Famously, during Magic Flute, he was messing with the Papageno on stage and playing the off-stage glockenspiel at the wrong time on purpose. So Mozart was a true character, and I think it's so special that even though he lived so many hundreds of years ago, we know a lot about him and about his composition, his struggles, and what he wanted in his music. And he wrote a wide variety of opera. So during this time period, even though people really valued that balance and rational thought, comedy, ironically, was a very popular art form. Beforehand, in the Baroque period, a comic opera really served more as filler for in-between acts of a tragic opera or an opera seria. So it's in this time period that then comic opera becomes its own genre and gets its own full performances, not just being the fluff in-between piece. And Mozart, in particular, has incredible comedies. And one of my absolute favorite pieces of his, The Marriage of Figaro, is, I think, one of the most funny operas of all time. And Mozart was just brilliant at that. He also wrote opera seria, which was the tragic opera at that time. It had kind of a set plot, so it's different from tragedy of what we think of now. It had this kind of set plot structure of this couple that wanted to be together and for some reason couldn't, usually because of a ruler or a tyrant who's overseeing, and that ruler self-sacrifices so that couple can be together. Keep in mind, who is probably watching this opera? A ruler, right? So this is always really intentional of we want this person to feel really good when they're watching an opera. So the tragic opera, the opera seria, always made that ruler feel really great. And Mozart wrote several of those. He wrote Singspiel, which was German comedy, which has spoken dialogue rather than recitative. And a major advancement that he did was the ensemble finale. This was a dramatic structural way to really end halfway through the show with a cliffhanger. So again, Marriage of Figaro has the best example of an ensemble finale where you have, starts with two characters and then sequentially you get each of the principals added, and every time another principal comes in, there's a little plot twist or there's another conflict that happens so that by the time the curtain comes down for intermission, it's utter chaos. And this is a great comic technique, right? Because you think you've resolved and then there's this issue, and everyone's like, wah! So there's also an ensemble finale at the end of Act 1 in Don Giovanni. It's just different because it's not a comedy. Instead, we're feeling that tension build with all of the drama that's going on. And if you've seen Amadeus, Mozart mentions his ensemble finale for Figaro in particular. He goes, it's wonderful, it's 20 minutes, no recitative, just music. And it really is 20 minutes long. So when you watch, know that, you gotta buckle up. But it's incredible, it's such great things. The thing that I just love so much about Mozart, though, I've been saying a lot that he's one of my favorite composers, and I think the reason for that is even though, he was a comic genius and he was a jokester, his music is some of the most beautiful, transformative music ever, and he just had this way of really humanizing his characters through the music that he writes. So we have an example for you today that my friend Mauricio is going to sing. This is Della Finestra, which is from Don Giovanni. It's a gorgeous aria that he's singing just to some random lady outside the window trying to seduce her. And so we get to see this really lovely part of Don Giovanni and why all these women just fall for him. Take it away.
Vieni alla finestra, o mio tesoro, e vieni a consolar il pianto mio. Se neghi a me di dar qualche ristoro, davanti agli occhi tuoi morir voglio. Toccai la bocca dolce più che il miele, tu che il zucchero porti in mezzo al cuore. Non esser gioia mia con me crudele, lasciati almen veder mio bel amore.
Thanks so much. And thank you, Jen Hoppy, at the piano. I should have said, I'm so sorry. But it's so I think that's such a great example, because I don't know if you hadn't known out of context, that character has already murdered someone, has already tried to rape someone. Like, why is that so gorgeous, right? But that's Mozart for you, right? He just, right, stunning music. And I think if you're thinking of it dramatically, it does show, okay, it's this guy, there's maybe more to him, or you can see why he's so able to seduce these women and change their mind, because he can sing so gorgeously like that. We can have the next slide now. So bring us into Don Giovanni, the opera. So this is one of 3 operas that Mozart wrote with Lorenzo da Ponte, one of the da Ponte operas as we call it. The first was The Marriage of Figaro, which premiered the previous year, so in 1786. And then he wrote Don Giovanni a year later, and then Così fan tutte a few years after that. So this is, when we look back at the operas, this collaboration was an incredible collaboration. Da Ponte writes really wonderful words, great libretto. Mozart sets it really fabulously to music, and that's partly why we perform those 3 operas a lot. Those 3 and Magic Flute, I think, are probably the 4 that you will see most frequently in the opera house. So this is based on the Don Juan story, which was a really common story for people to set in the theater in the 18th century, which brings back, if you've looked at any of Arizona Opera's leaflets or works, you might see the word iconic on there. That's the word that we're using to describe our season, as we're telling iconic stories. We started with Frankenstein, then we did Barbara of Seville, which has iconic music that is in pop culture, then Romeo and Juliet, and now we are doing the iconic story of Don Juan, which of course was very popular during that time period, but even today, we know very similar stories, or similar characters even pop up in things like sitcoms, like Friends. If you know that show, the character of Joey, I would say, is kind of a Don Juan. Or another show I love is How I Met Your Mother, the character of Barney Stinson, also a Don Juan character. And of course, that's in a comic setting. Now that it's modern, we're able to kind of play with it a bit and take away some of the villain aspect of that character and more poke fun. But this particular one, Da Ponte based this libretto on a 1-act comic opera, which is called Il Convitato di Pietra, which means the stone guest. So the thing that really is the crux of the story in Don Giovanni is the murder of the commendatore at the very beginning, and then when the commendatore comes, when the statue comes to life at the end, which we'll talk about in a bit. So it seems like Da Ponte really got that idea from that version that he then expanded into this full opera, which is called a dramma giocoso. It's the only dramma giocoso that Mozart wrote that literally means a joking drama, or like lighthearted drama, which already you hear that title and you go, what does that mean? Like a drama, but it's not too dramatic? I don't know. And if you watch Don Giovanni, it's still pretty dramatic. Like, begins with a murder. Don't get more dramatic than that. Just right out of the gate. So more of what's going on, because especially as a modern audience, when we watch this, sometimes we're just kind of scratching our heads of what? And Mozart and Da Ponte are really playing with juxtaposing comedy and drama, especially in this piece. It's something that Mozart did already a bit in his previous operas, especially in like Marriage of Figaro. He will have what we think of as more seria characters and then more buffa characters. So the more serious characters, their music is usually more virtuosic. It's more complex from even just a theory perspective if you're studying it. Whereas the more comic characters have much more lighthearted music. It's usually shorter, it's more singable, and he really takes that and brings it even bigger in Don Giovanni. Part of that, too, is he's really influenced by Commedia dell'arte and those stock characters that people would have been familiar with or have known in Commedia dell'arte. So, for example, the couple, Masetto and Zerlina, is a Commedia dell'arte archetype that the lovers. Don Giovanni, as well, is also an archetype of, I believe it was the captain or the pirate, the kind of like swaggering villain sort of guy. So that's, when you're watching Don Giovanni, keep in mind, okay, these are really kind of stock characters that Mozart is playing with, and he's playing with the more serious characters versus the comic characters. And he really sets that up even just right off the bat with the overture. The music begins with music that he will use later for when the Commendatore comes back and confronts Don Giovanni. And then about halfway through the overture, it switches to something much more lighthearted and more of what sounds like the overture to something like Marriage of Figaro or Così or even Magic Flute. So if you go to see the show, just keep in mind of if it feels like it's kind of switching back and forth, that's intentional. So I thought we could have some examples of that. So first, Melissa's going to come up and sing Batti Batti, which is a great example of that comic aria from Zerlina, and then we'll get the duet where Don Giovanni is trying to seduce her. So we're actually going out of order in the story, but that's a little bit more dramatic of duet.
Thank you.
So like I said, we're kind of going out of order, actually, so sorry. So this duet, La Ci darem la mano, is Don Giovanni has come and crashed Seralina's wedding and is like, okay, everybody go party at my house, but I want to talk to the bride, and attempts to seduce her like you do.
La ci darem la mano, la mi dirai di sì. Veni non è lontano, partiam bel mio da qui.
Vorrei e non vorrei, mi trema in poco il cor, felice versarei, ma può burlarmi ancor,
Vieni mio bel diletto,
e fa pietà, masetto.
io cangerò tua sorte.
Presto non son più forte, non son più forte, non son più forte.
Vieni, la ci darem la mano.
Vorrei e non vorrei.
La mi dirai di sì.
Mi piace dono il cor.
Partiam bel mio da qui.
Può burlarmi ancor.
Vieni mio bel
E fa
diletto,
pietà,
io cangerò tua sorte. Andiam, andiam. Andiam, andiam, mio bene, a ristorar le pene con innocente amor. Andiam, andiam, mio bene, a ristorar le pene con innocente amor. Andiam, 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 mio bene, andiam, le pene a ristorar d'un innocente amor.
So shameless plug, you can see both Melissa and Mauricio in our production of Don Giovanni. They're both going to be in the chorus, so please come out and see them and support them. Wonderful. They're wonderful people, and I'm glad to know all three of them. So let's see. Did I have anything else in this? Sorry, let me check. Yeah, we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So when we discussed Don Giovanni in school, I remember, because actually I was much more familiar with the other Mozart operas just because they're performed more, Marriage of Figaro, Magic Flute, Così, and I was preparing for this lecture and I realized, I was like, I haven't actually seen Don Giovanni, I should probably see it, so I watched the full thing, and then I remembered, oh right, when we studied this in school, really, the only thing we talked about was the final scene, the commendatore scene, and I didn't quite understand why that was the only thing that I really talked about in opera history and in school until I saw it. and then it all makes sense, because really the rest of the opera is pretty typical of Mozart. It's we have this commedia characters, the seria versus buffa characters juxtaposed, lots of wonderful arias and ensembles. And this final scene, though, is so different from everything else in the opera, and really from anything else that Mozart had really written. It's completely different, and the element of supernatural that comes into it is really cool. So a little context about this. Actually, Don Giovanni had two different endings when Mozart wrote it. So when it premiered in Prague in 1787, it has this scene where the Commendatore comes back to life, drags Don Giovanni down into hell, and then ended with a final moral chorus, which again was really typical of that time period because it gives that sense of balance. There's the reason of like, okay, this is why we showed you this story. Here's what to learn from it. Go on and go on your way, which actually that is the ending Arizona Opera will be doing, the original one. But a year later, when it premiered in Vienna, Mozart got rid of that final chorus. So it ended with this very dramatic sense of Don Giovanni getting dragged into hell, which is really more of a romantic idea from the the following century, where they cared much more about drama and emotional expression. So kind of an interesting choice that he made. And so a little background on what's going on, the plot of the story. So I mentioned that the entire opera begins with a murder. Don Giovanni kills the Commendatore at the very beginning of the opera when he's trying to seduce the Commendatore's daughter, Donna Anna. And they come running out, she's screaming like, oh, this man's trying to seduce me, and so he kills her father. And so over the course of the opera, Donna Anna and then her husband, Don Ottavio, are vowing to take vengeance against the Commendatore and kind of show everybody who Don Giovanni is and reveal him. And then Don Oliveira is also flying in and yelling about Don Giovanni too. Many people are angry at him. And then he's going around. It's really funny. She really just kind of pops out of nowhere like a harpy, and it's just like, what are you doing? At any time he's trying to seduce someone else. It's kind of great. And then of course we see him seducing Zerlina. So we see him doing these goings on, and we hear about this tension building about this murder that he committed. And then towards the end of the opera, he and his servant Leporello, who's another one of the more comic characters, are in the cemetery, and they see the statue of the Commendatore, and there's something odd going on with that statue. His eyes are glowing depending on the staging of what happens, and Leporello feels very uneasy, and he's like, oh, something is wrong. Something is afoot. Don Giovanni doesn't think anything of it. He laughs, and he says, invite him to dinner. Bring him over to dinner. So the final scene, Don Giovanni and Leporello are having dinner. Once again, Don Oliveira runs in and screams at Don Giovanni. But then the Commendatore shows up and actually comes to dinner, and the music is very different at that point. At the very beginning of the scene, though, this is kind of a funny little like Easter egg that Mozart puts in there. I mentioned that Don Giovanni premiered a year later in Prague, the same place that it had premiered in The Marriage of Figaro. And in that dinner scene, before the Commendatore shows up, Mozart quotes a little bit of an aria from Marriage of Figaro, a bit of Non più andrai, which is an aria that Figaro sings to Cherubino, one of the characters, telling him, okay, you have to leave like your nice clothes that you're wearing and become a soldier. So it's a little bit of foreshadowing of maybe saying, hey, Don Giovanni, you really do need to change your ways and quickly, otherwise things are going to go badly. But it's also a joke to the audience. Leporello literally says, oh, I know this tune when it starts playing, and probably that got a really big chuckle in the premiere because they would have known Marriage of Figaro really well. So let's go ahead to the musical example so we can hear that little clip of Non più andrai. So this is the one that's starting at 3 minutes, 40 seconds. So I think this was the other tab that you had opened because it wasn't working in the slides. Yeah, thank you.
Questa poi la conosco Schietto mascalzone, non mi lascia un'altrusione, le parole proferir, mentre raggio, fischia poco, non so far cos'è. Scusate, si eccellente il vostro cuore, si eccellente il vostro cuore, che la voglia Dio provar, che la voglia Dio provar. Si eccellente anche il provar.
All right, you can pause there. Here comes Don Olivera, right? You can pause when you're able. Thank you.
Cos'è? Di Marafino, cosa volete? Se non sorgete, non respondete.
Thank you. So this is a great example of what, isn't that wonderful? But so that's Don Olivera for you too. And actually we'll be getting to that, back to that video. Sorry for the going back and forth in a sec. But yeah, so she kind of always comes in. What happened is somewhere before the opera, Don Giovanni seduced her and got her to leave her husband, and he said he was gonna marry her, and then he ran away. So she keeps trying to be like, no, marry me, come on, every time he's trying to seduce someone else. So we have that bit of lightheartedness, right, of quoting a comedy that everyone knew, everyone's laughing, and then the commendatore is going to come in and really change the scene. And the music is strikingly different here, and the thing to note is Mozart's use of trombones, which he uses pretty sparingly in his composition, and usually it's he saves it for like sacred music or something that's really supposed to be very serious. So he uses trombones in the tuba mirum in the Requiem, and so the fact here when the commendatore comes in is pretty significant. So if we could go to that same video, and then if you fast forward to 8 minutes 36 seconds, that's when commendatore comes in. Perfect. And that's probably good. We can stop there. Thank you. Thanks. I know. I'm sorry to stop it, but it'll go on and we'll be here all day. But it's so, I mean, that really brings you to the end of the opera. So, spoiler alert, Commendatore asks Don Giovanni, will you repent? It's kind of his final thing of like, you have to change your ways. Don Giovanni says no. And so he gets dragged down to hell. And actually, I learned this morning Melissa is going to help take him down to hell in the production, which is really cool. So, right? Fun things that you learn behind the scenes. Absolutely. So if we could go to the final slide that I had, it has a stage picture and some costume pictures on there. I wanted to talk really briefly about our production at Arizona Opera. So this image we have here is the image from the last time we did Don Giovanni, which was during the 2015-2016 season. And we're using those same costumes for this production, but the set will be different. But I'm a total nerd, and I love the process of bringing a production into life. So I tried to put the renderings of the costume when they were first being designed near the character. So over on, I guess your left is Donna Anna, and there she is, second in from the left in that same costume. Don Ottavio, his costume rendering is right above him. And then Donna Alvira is over to the right. That's her rendering and her costume. So when there's kind of two ways that you can go about with a production, right? You can either create a completely new production, which is what happened in 2015-16, of creating new costumes and building them for that person, or you can remount a production that's already been used. So you can rent existing costumes, you can rent existing sets. So this one's kind of a mix of both, which is cool. We're reusing costumes from before, but that can also be a tricky process because, right, they were built for the people in those photos, but now the people in those photos are not singing those roles. So they'll have to adjust the costumes, and this can be tricky, especially if you're renting a costume from another place. If they use specific material that's difficult to find where you are, that can be an extra challenge of trying to make the alterations on the costumes. But for the set pieces, instead of having the set piece that you see there, we're using projections, which is going to be really cool. It's going to be able to add a little bit more life to the show that you're seeing. You can see leaves blowing in the wind. You can see costumes moving. I mean, the things that we're able to do now, almost 10 years later, that we're mounting the same production is so cool with technology. So the original costumes were designed by Kathleen Trott, and the scenic designs that we're seeing, that was, oh no, I don't have him down here. Who was that, Cassie? Can you yell it out, Gary? Barry Steele, thank you so much. Yeah, so those are going to be really cool to see. So our production is also directed by Tara Faircloth, who has directed many shows with Arizona Opera before. I've been in several of her productions. She's wonderful. And I got a chance to look at some of her program notes. She said that she wanted to wait to direct Don Giovanni until she was past 40 and later in life, because she thinks that the way that she interprets it is that Don Giovanni is in a way going through a midlife crisis, because the question she asked was like, why is this guy the way that he is? Like, is he just a villain? Is he kind of lost his way? Like, why does he do what he does? So her thought was that really that murder of the Commendatore is a turning point for Don Giovanni, that he's then faced with mortality, and especially at that age, being middle through your life, going, oh man, okay, what am I gonna do with the rest of my life? So he tries to ignore it and fill it with partying and seducing women and all things, to then it just really come back to bite him in the worst way. And we're really special that our production also has some great Arizona natives in it. So the lead role, Don Giovanni, on April 20th, is going to be performed by Richard Oyasaba, who I actually went to high school with, so that's so cool. And then one of the Donna Annas that same night, Vanessa Vasquez, who's performed with us many times, she is also an Arizona native from Scottsdale. I did not go to high school with her. We did not overlap. A bit of an age difference there, but anywho. So I really hope that you're able to come out and see our production. I think it's going to be an incredible show. I've heard the cast is wonderful. I'm really excited to see it. That's going to be April 20th at 7:30 p.m. at Symphony Hall, and on the 21st at 2 p.m. in Symphony Hall, and then the following weekend, the 27th and 28th, down in Tucson at Tucson Music Hall. So we have a couple minutes if there's any questions. I know I flew through that because there's a lot of great info. Yeah.
Mozart was German, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Austrian, but yeah, close enough.
Yet Da Ponte, I assume, is Italian.
Yes.
How did they work together? Did Mozart travel to Italy to work with him, or how did that work?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know how they met. I know that very famously Mozart did tour in Italy a lot. When he was younger, I mentioned his father, Leopold, had a big hand in his musical education. His father was a musician and probably saw Mozart's talent very, very young, and so got ahead of it and went, okay, we're going to really make sure he gets a great education. So he famously, when Mozart was younger, took him on a tour of Italy. So even though Mozart was Austrian, many of his operas, like Don Giovanni, are sung in Italian. He also did have some operas in German, like Magic Flute, with different librettists. But that's a great question. I'll have to look up how they actually crossed paths, because it's such an important collaboration for sure. And he did also have performances in Italy as well of other pieces. He would have things in Venice and stuff like that. Great question. Any others? Yeah.
So, buffa is less comic than jocosa.
Buffa is more comic than jocosa. So exactly. So the word that we use in opera for comedy is opera buffa, at least for older. But we then use the word comedy later, kind of from the word buffoon. So yeah, an opera buffa is your classic slapstick comedy. So exactly. Jocosa, I think, was meant to be that it's lighthearted.
Light opera fit in that. When people refer to light opera on that scale.
Right, so that's probably more like operetta is the word that we use for light opera. And we really consider operetta like Offenbach, who, if you know the Can, Offenbach wrote that, but also Gilbert and Sullivan is a great example of operetta, which is also kind of funny because that kind of crosses the line of, okay, is it more music theater? Is it more opera? And so it's one of those things, it's sung with that operatic technique, but also the way the music is written is a little more music theater-y. So another great question of that distinction. Yeah. Any others? Great. Well, I hope that you all had a wonderful morning. Thank you so much for coming out. Again, we hope to see you at the Opera House, and have a wonderful rest of your day.